Welcome to Main Street Podcast, an opportunity to talk to Idaho's elected leaders about the issues that matter to you. Welcome to the Main Street Podcast. We are here with Representative Chenele Dixon out of District 24 and Representative Dan Garner out of District 28. Representative Dixon, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Representative Garner, appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thank you. It's always nice to be included.
Yeah, I was going to say this morning, you don't have the whole world in your hands. You have the whole world behind your back. So for those listening without any visuals, they've got a beautiful map of the world right behind them. And if we need to know where anything's at, Representative Garner is going to get up and play weatherman and point to the right area at the right time. Now then, Representative Dixon, when you were on the podcast later in the summer, in August, I think is when you were on, or around that time, we talked about a number of issues. And one of the things was the fentanyl crisis and the drug issues we're having in this state. So you've teamed up with Representative Garner, and we're working with a number of your colleagues on legislation to address that. Why don't you give us a brief overview of what House Bill 406 does and how that's working on some of the issues that your community's worried about?
Okay. So it is regarding fentanyl, which is, excuse me, one of the most dangerous drugs that's out there right now on our streets. And it adds fentanyl to our mandatory minimums that we currently have for marijuana, cocaine, meth, and heroin. We don't have fentanyl in there. And so this adds fentanyl. And if someone was convicted of trafficking fentanyl, they would receive a mandatory minimum sentence. And the minimum weight would be 2 milligrams is a lethal dose. And so 4 grams is 2,000 lethal doses. And so it would do that. And then the second part of the bill is a drug-induced homicide. And so if someone received drugs and they died from it, the person that had provided those could be convicted of drug-induced homicide, and they would receive up to life in prison, and I think it's a maximum of $25,000 fine for that. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach to help keep fentanyl off our streets.
Is that second part of the bill, is that also specific to fentanyl, that if there was an overdose, is fentanyl related, or is it any drugs in general that would receive that?
It's specific to fentanyl, and I should clarify that that's not if someone gives, like if I was to give Representative Dixon a pill, that's not me. I mean, it is, but if I'm willing to turn over and say who I got the pills from, it would be then that person. So it goes up the chain. It's the
supplier.
Yeah, this bill is designed to go after the traffickers and suppliers of this deadly drug.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Representative Garner, your time is spread thin in the little bit of time that you have in the Capitol. For all of you legislators, of all the priorities that you have to deal with, why this one and why now?
I was at a Meet the Candidate forum in Bannock County, and I'm a strong education supporter, and I was explaining my policy on education and what I wanted to do with education. And then after the meeting, I had a young mother come up to me and say that if I did get elected, I needed to do something on fentanyl. She'd lost her son, to fentanyl. And I talked with her probably for 30 minutes and heard her story of how dangerous this drug is. And I decided that if I did get elected, that was after the help in education, that was the next thing I was going to address.
A politician trying to keep a campaign promise? Stop the presses.
I know it's new, but...
Representative Dixon, I know you've heard similar stories from victims' parents. What is it that you've learned as you've talked to those that have experienced the worst of this crisis, and how has that shaped this legislation?
Well, I think one of the things is, when we spoke last time and I had mentioned fentanyl mandatory minimums, I knew it was a crisis. during the summer in Twin Falls County. So in my district, there was a drug bust. There were 2 drug busts within a month's time where they confiscated 15 pounds of fentanyl. And that's enough to kill everyone in Idaho, Montana, and most of Wyoming. So it has just progressed. I mean, there was last month in December 5,300 pills seized in Idaho Falls. It's just growing. And when I had first started learning about this and talking about it, thinking about it, I talked to prosecutors and I talked to, a lot of people. But one of the things that happened since I last talked to you, I had a friend who lost his daughter to a fentanyl overdose. And it does become a lot more personal when you hear those stories, and it's tragic. I don't think most of the time when people die from a fentanyl overdose, they don't even know they're taking fentanyl because so many of the other drugs are being laced with fentanyl. And so a lot of times they may think they're, taking, not that cocaine is healthy or anything, but they might be taking cocaine, but it's laced with fentanyl. And that's actually what causes them to die. And so it really became um, a lot more personal when you have those connections. And I don't want it to get to the point where everybody has some connection to somebody that has died from fentanyl. We need to stop it now. And I think our mandatory minimums, if we can get fentanyl added to those, it will be a deterrent. We know it's been a deterrent in those other drugs to drug traffickers. They don't want to come into Idaho. Um, the law enforcement has recordings of voicemails and texts of drug traffickers saying, we don't want to come to Idaho. But they know there's nothing for fentanyl here. But if we can get that added, it will be a deterrent. And I think in the end, the result of that is that we save lives of our children and, our community members. So
Yeah, this drug is very, very potent. It's 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. And the public needs to realize that these pills that the DEA is seizing, they're telling us and reporting to us that 6 out of 10 of those fentanyl pills contain a deadly lethal dose.
Your bill focuses on traffickers because so many of the users are not necessarily willingly and knowingly taking fentanyl. Help us understand, why is it that other drugs are laced with fentanyl unknowingly to the user?
It's cheaper for them to produce fentanyl than it is these other drugs. And by lacing these other drugs with fentanyl, they get a stronger high, or a what they perceive as a better high, not healthier for sure. But so that's why we're getting all this fentanyl from China coming in through Mexico.
Yeah, man, it's awful, but so interesting. So you're saying, number one, you can get people hooked, and number two, it's cheaper to produce. Any idea how they're producing fentanyl?
well, we know, I mean, I'm not an expert in producing fentanyl, but the it's coming over from China, and I think they produce part of it, right? And then it comes and it gets processed largely outside of the US, much of it in Mexico. And then and it can come in all different forms once it's produced. It can be powder, it can be pills, and then they mix it with whatever other drugs or whatever else they're mixing it with. So when we see it, when the law enforcement sees it in a car or whatever, they're having their drug bust. It can be powder, it can be pills, but it's it's a pretty, I don't know, it's pretty amazing how infiltrated our country is right now with fentanyl. So during the hearing that we had in our committee meeting, some DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency stats were shared with us. And in 2023, what was actually seized around the country, well, it was across the borders. So it doesn't only come from our southern border. We're also seeing it from the Canadian border coming into our country. But there were 76,500,000 pills of fentanyl that were seized and 19,000 pounds of fentanyl powder. And that is enough to kill 384 million people. So everyone in the United States. And they said that they think that probably 4 times that amount has actually gotten through because clearly they're not stopping everything that's coming through. So it's a serious crisis. And, we're seeing a lot of that in Idaho. And we are kind of a thoroughfare to get to other states. And so we don't want any of it in our country, but we most certainly don't want to be the pass through or, have any stops here in Idaho.
The other thing that I found interesting about this DEA report was that they're now starting to ship the ingredients to make the fentanyl into the US, and they've actually seized a couple pill presses this side of the border. So it is a growing problem, and we need to definitely support the Blue on this issue and give them the tools they need to stop this fentanyl trafficking.
And let's talk about that. I've spoken to law enforcement local in eastern Idaho about fentanyl, and that is clearly the number one issue that they're dealing with. And the sheriff had said that he is a strong advocate of anything that will get this stuff off the streets. But that may be different when you talk to law enforcement as a whole. As you speak to the law enforcement community, are they supportive of the legislation?
They are very supportive. All the law enforcement agencies that I've talked to are strongly in favor of this, and they ask us to pass it and give them this tool in their toolbox to help stop the deaths that are happening in Idaho.
Yeah, when I've talked to prosecutors and policemen, everybody that I've spoken to is very supportive of it.
So we have candidates that run, and in their elections, most of them in Idaho, particularly Republicans, proudly announce that they back the Blue and that they support law and order and tough on crime. So why is it that legislation like this hasn't been able to get across the finish line in the past? And who are the roadblocks to keep this from getting across the finish line this session? Representative Garner, why don't we start with you?
Right, I appreciate that. I think that's what was so frustrating last year was they weren't understood. Well, I think they understood, but what we're trying to do is move the drug fentanyl into the mandatory minimums already that are there, the drugs that are covered by that, and it's a lot worse drug than these other ones. And I think they used it as an opportunity to attack the idea of mandatory minimums, and that's what kind of slowed it down last year. And it's frustrating to me because how many Idaho lives have been lost in this year that it's taken to get it back before the legislature.
Thoughts, Representative Dixon?
Well, I think, a lot of what we heard about the mandatory minimums last session came from testimonies from people who were out of state. And that was really interesting too, because when you have attorneys coming from other states to tell us what we should be doing in Idaho, it's, I don't know, a little disturbing, I guess. This year we didn't see that. The people who testified were from Idaho. But one of the things that we did see, we had some parents that shared their testimonies of losing their children to fentanyl. And it's tragic. I mean, it's just so terrible to see the grief that families have. But interestingly, some of them were there to oppose the mandatory minimum sentence, which I had a hard time understanding because I feel like if we can keep fentanyl off the streets, then their children might still be here. If we had been able to have fentanyl added already to our mandatory minimums, it might have saved save their children. And so I think that's one of the things that people need to understand is that it's not going to throw your drug user into prison. It's aimed at the traffickers who are selling these drugs and bringing them into Idaho. And the mandatory minimums will decrease the trafficking in Idaho and decrease the amount of drugs in Idaho, and that it will decrease the impact for drug users in Idaho. And it's just one prong, it's one leg of a stool that we have to try to help decrease drug use. It's not, when we can decrease the amount of drugs coming in here, that's one prong. And then we have a lot of good programs in place throughout Idaho to help drug addicts. And so we need all of those approaches to be successful to fight drugs here.
So, and the argument against mandatory minimums, kind of universally, is that you catch up people. People get caught up in a mandatory minimum that were struggling, that were having a bad day, and it turned them into hardened criminals, and you ruined their lives. But again, I think it bears repeating: the people that will be caught up in the mandatory minimums under this House bill are the traffickers, are not the people who fell on hard times and couldn't break an addiction. These are people who've made a livelihood out of destroying other people's lives. And as other states around us go the opposite way in drug laws and decriminalization, why is it so important that Idaho fights against the current in this one, Representative Garner?
I think history will show that the opposite way doesn't work. We've got like Chenele Dixon mentioned, they've got recordings of traffickers saying, "I don't want to go through Idaho," to their higher ups because of the mandatory minimums. I believe the mandatory minimums work. Like you said, we're not going after the user. There's 250 or 100 pills. Think about the bottle of aspirin or Tylenol you buy at Walmart, how big that is. That's not for personal use. That's for trafficking or selling to others and destroying other people's lives. And these are the people we're going after. And if it stops one trafficker, then the drug cartel has to get another trafficker, and sooner or later, you're gonna slow the chain and slow the flow. And I might add that only 2.9% of the incarcerations in the jails are for trafficking. And so the argument that we're going to fill up the jails or the prisons and clog the system is just not true.
Interesting. Now, I think it must be mentioned, something that you don't have a lot of power over, but is a big problem in this, that was briefly mentioned, is the crisis at our southern border is not helping. It's fueling the issue. Representative Dixon, why don't you speak a little bit to, maybe this failed administration's attempts at border security and how that's only made your guys' lives more difficult as you fight this fentanyl crisis?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we need to close our border. We need to have legal immigration and a process, and to just have our borders be open the way they are with this current administration is a disaster. And for the drugs coming in, when they say that they think 4 times as much drugs have come in as what they've seized, and they've seized 76 million fentanyl pills this year, in 2023, that's a huge problem. And like you said, that's a federal issue. And we're asking our federal government to do something about this because it's just unsustainable to have this amount of drugs coming in through our southern border. And I don't know, hopefully we can encourage and continue to encourage our federal government to do something, because it's really becoming a scourge on the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
I might add that these mandatory minimums on drug trafficking is the only tool. Well, it's not the only tool, but it's our way of addressing the southern border crisis and trying to tighten down Idaho's borders. And if they have drive around Idaho, I'm very much happy with that result.
That's fair. Now, what we need from you two is some insider baseball. Representative Dixon, you mentioned that the bill has been heard in your committee. Walk us through what the outlook and the path to passing this bill actually looks like.
Well, on Tuesday in our Judiciary and Rules Committee, we'll meet again and we'll discuss as a committee all of the testimony that we heard. And then we'll take a vote. And if it passes out of committee, then it'll be heard on the floor of the House and we'll take a vote, with all 70 members of the House. And then, of course, it'll go over to the Senate and kind of go through a similar process. And assuming that it passes, it will go on to the governor to be signed. And I mean, I'm really hopeful that we can get it to the floor this time. Last time we were not successful, but I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to get it to the floor this time.
Yeah, Representative Garner, what's standing in the way? I mean, we've talked to Senator Cook about his cell phone bill, and it seemed like such a no-brainer as we listened to it. But there are special interest groups with out-of-state money that are doing everything they can to rank it as the worst thing in Idaho. And this bill, oddly enough, has kind of a similar path of resistance where there are groups that are saying anything but this, even though your attempt is to rid Idaho of fentanyl and protect our kids from overdose. If I'm a parent and I'm listening to the podcast right now and I'm thinking I have to do something about this, Representative, walk us through what we can do.
Well, Representative Dixon mentioned there's a lot of out-of-state money being spent on this, fighting it. And what I would encourage the public to do if is to reach out to your state legislators, your senators, and your representatives, and shoot them an email or call them and urge them to vote for House Bill 406. Share your personal stories. Let them know how it's touched your lives, and let them know that you don't want it to touch your neighbors' lives.
Fantastic. We're wrapping up right now. Our time is drawing nigh, and I think it's important to note that it is bright and early when we're recording this. And this is not an 8 to 5 job for you two. We started early this morning, and you two are going to run off to a long day of meetings. No naps for you two today. But before we call it good for the day, fentanyl is addressing this fentanyl crisis is a priority for the two of you, but you're working on a number of issues. So, Representative Garner, why don't we start with you, and why don't you give us a few issues that you're working on off the top of your head that our listeners can look forward to seeing?
Well, I serve on the Education Committee and Agricultural Committee. I'm bringing a bill forward in the Agricultural Committee to clean up the statutes for soil conservation districts. There was some, it was very vague, and we're just kind of solidifying a few things in that statute. And then, of course, education's always a hot committee, and I'm sure you'll see my opinion on educational tax credits and different things like that as we move forward.
I'm going to go ahead and guess it's probably not in favor.
That is a good guess.
Representative Dixon, what are some things you're working on?
Well, one of the things is to add Idaho to the counseling compact. So there are about 30 states around the United States that have organized a compact for counselors. And so what that really does is allow people who live in a compact state to also get a privilege to practice in another state that's part of the compact. And it's really also helpful for our military families, because if they have a spouse that's a counselor and they come from a compact state to another one, they can easily start practicing. And so it will help access to counselors within Idaho. I think it's a good, strong bill. So hopefully we can get it through to the end. And then another one that's kind of fun is a ski patrol bill. So I'm working on a bill that would bring volunteer ski patrollers under our Good Samaritan laws, because we discovered that they are not, when they're the volunteer ski patrollers, they're not covered by mountain insurance to do what they are there to do. And, they have extensive training in getting people down the mountain, but we just need to get them some protection from liability as well. So that's what that bill will do, then we'll probably hear that next week in Juden Rules. So
You just woke up our studio tech here, who's a diehard skier. He just jumped. You're speaking his language. He said, I hope those who are listening can tell how much you two are really trying to tackle the issues that your constituents are bringing to you. I think it's obvious that you're listening, and if anyone out there has opinions, I'm sure you two are more than welcome to hear them, to field them, and then to work on those issues. So as we close today, I hope you two know how much we appreciate you coming on the podcast, and we'd invite you back on as the legislative storm starts roaring even louder here in the coming weeks.
great. Thank you.
Thank you, Brennan.
Yeah, thanks
we
for having
appreciate
us.
that.
Okay, you two have a wonderful day, and be safe. We'll see you.